Hi, I'm Janice Black and I'll be doing BBQ Block of the Month this year. So I wanted to show you our very first August block. This is one called Log Cabin Frames, and Log Cabin is a very old traditional quilt block. Usually it's made by adding dark strips to one side and light strips to the other, and then those can be arranged, the dark and light strips, into really cool overall patterns. But we're doing something completely different. I think you'll find this fun because it doesn't require a lot of math. It has a lot of flexibility. You can make choices as you go along. But what we'll be doing is using the same technique, the log cabin frame, to frame a really special fabric. In this case, we chose the Cape Facet squares. It could be any feature fabric that you have that you really want to show off. So what you're basically doing is adding frames to it. Let me talk about color choices for a little bit. I tend to go with more muted, natural colors, so I found these colors that I thought went well with my cinder square. But when I'm taking a close look at them, I was thinking, I probably should have picked something that was brighter to kind of bring out the flower. So I took a look at some other fabrics, maybe in fuchsias, and I think any of those would maybe do the job. But when I took a close look at this, I realized even though these colors are more pure of colors and they pop, I still don't have much of a contrast in value, and that's important. If you took a grayscale picture of these, they would all pretty much end up being the same shade of gray. So I took a look and ended up with this purple, which is actually a quite dark value, and I think it will help to give me more contrast. Now, I can decide later where in the lineup I want the purple to go, but I think I'm going to end up with these 4 fabrics. Remember, you may end up with only 2 fabrics, or 3, or 4. I'm not really sure how many I'll end up having space for. You can make them a different variety of widths, and that's kind of what makes this fun. But in the end, your square, the goal is for it to be 10 inches unfinished. And I know that's a little confusing because you might think, well, I finished the block, so why is that unfinished? All that means is that from one raw edge to the other is 10 inches. It's called unfinished because the blocks aren't sewn together with other blocks yet. Okay, so I've decided to make purple be my first fabric, and so I've chosen this size of strip. You can choose whatever size you want as long as you keep it nice and even all the way down. That isn't so important, but what is important is that you make sure your strip is long enough. So you could do the math. You need to know it needs to go around here 4 times. But I'm going to do it without math, just putting my block down here and making sure it fits 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I will also need to add the width of the strip 4 times. So I'll just do that. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's long enough. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my square and put it on here so that it lines up pretty close to one end. And I'll go and stitch this down across here. Okay, I have my first strip done. I went ahead and lined up the edges of my square with the end of my strip, right sides together, and sewed it down here. So what I want to do now is just make sure that it's nice and neat and square. And since I already have a square here, if I just cut it very carefully along that edge and make sure it's nice and square, then I shouldn't have to measure that strip as I'm going along. So I took that end off. And then I'm going to, where it comes out just a little there, I'm going to square up this side, lining this up with that. Okay, that looks pretty good and square, so I'm just going to take that off. And as I'm doing that, yay, I'm avoiding math again. Now I'm going to go and press this, and then I'll be ready to put on my second side the same way. I'll line up the end, making sure that it maybe just is slightly over, and then I will stitch along here. So I'm going to go do that and be back. Okay, so I have finished putting all 4 sides on. I have my first little square. It didn't come out terribly square, so I cut in a little more than I should have there. So I can either go ahead and square it up and make it a little bit smaller, or I think in this case, well, okay, I'm going to go ahead and trim that off. I could also just wait and see how it comes out after the next round, but I'm just going to take that side off. Now it's not completely square, but I do have a completely straight edge there. Okay, I think I'm going to go with this one for my next fabric. And I want a wider strip with this one. I'm thinking maybe about that wide. So let's see, that is 1.5 inches plus I'm going to need my 1/2 inch. So two inches basically with my 1/2 inch seam allowance is what I'm going to need that to be. So I'm going to double check and be sure my strip is long enough. The way I did before, I'm going to put this down 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. And if I have a 2-inch wide strip, I'm going to have 8 more inches there. And I have 7. So I can either make that strip a little narrower, or in this case, it doesn't matter because I have such a wide piece, I can just do 2 strips and end up having what I need. Okay, this is what my square is looking like now that it has a second frame on it. And you might notice the edges are starting to get just a little bit ruffledy. This is not a good method to use for something large like the bindings on a quilt because they'll get very ruffledy when you're just matching them up instead of measuring them. But for a small block like this, it should be fine because you can square it up at each step as you go. So I'm going to take, I love this great big squaring thing. It works for all kinds of sizes. But let's see how big my block is right now. It looks like it's about 8 1/8. So I'm going to go ahead and square it up to exactly 8 inches and then we'll move on. Okay, so now I have a perfectly square 8-inch block, and that's one reason I wasn't too concerned when I had to trim one of my purple edges earlier because I knew I could make it square on the next round. So now that I'm up to 8 inches, I really do need to stop and think about some math because remember the goal is for this block to be 10 inches when it's completed. The unfinished measurement will be 10 inches. So if I'm at 8 inches right now, that, once you've taken off a 1/4 inch seam allowance all around, will give me a 7.5 inch finished block here. So that means I have 2.5 inches left to get up to my 10 inches. That would be 1 1/4 inches on each side. So I can either make my next strip big enough that it will be 1 1/4 inches plus a little so that I can square it up, or I could put a very teeny tiny narrow strip and so that I'd have room for a little wider one on the outside. I could even cut this down a little smaller if I needed to, because the one thing that I really want to avoid is having a very, very narrow strip for that very final outer round. If I have a wider strip, I can make it slightly larger and cut it down to exactly 10 inches square. But if I have a very narrow strip, that isn't going to work very well. I might end up with only an 1/8 inch or something that was showing in the end. So I need to start thinking about math now. I think what I'm going to do is make my next border very, very narrow so that I will have room for a slightly wider one in the outside. So let's see, with 1 1/4 inches left, I could make this one just a 1/4 inch wide and that one an inch wide. That would be hard to work with, but it would certainly be easier when this is on the inside than when it's on the outside. So I may do that. As I have this part finished though, I'm really starting to see that this brown really has very, very little contrast. So I may actually go ahead and try to put another row of purple in there and see how that would look if I have enough fabric left. Let me see how, if I compared, I think I might like that a little bit better. So I just need to make sure that I still have enough fabric left to do that. So once again, I'm going to take my square and measure 1, 2 times, and it's going to be a very narrow strip. So let's see here. If I cut it in half, then I would have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I would have enough. Okay, I think that's going to work. So I'm going to go make a very narrow purple strip and then see if I can finish off with this one. Okay, I ended up going ahead and cutting this square back to 7.5 inches so that I'd have a little bit more wiggle room in my last 2 rows because I really wanted to get in 2 more fabrics before I got to my 10 inches. So what I've done here, I'm going to have a very, very narrow strip of purple, and it looks so beautiful. I really wish I had just gone with a wide purple border and called it good, but it's a little bit too late to do that now. So what I wanted to show you was, when you are working with a very narrow strip like this, it can be really hard to get it nice and even. So sometimes it's actually better to make it a little bit larger and cut it down. So what I'm doing in this case is, I want this strip to end up I ended up making it just 5/8 inch wide here, and it's just much easier, much neater. I'm going to line this up with a straight line here. If now that I have one side sewn down, I trim it rather than trying to work with a very tiny piece like that. Okay, this should, let's see how big this has gotten me up to. It looks like I'm at 8 1/4 inches. So let's see, that's going to be 7 3/4 when I'm finished. So I'll have 1/4 is to 8 inch and then 2 1/4 inches left. So if I make each side, say 1 1/2 inches, I'm going to aim a little over, then I'll be past my 10 inches and I'll be able to square it up to an exact 10 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these that wide and make my final round. Okay, I've trimmed my block down and it measures exactly 10 inches from one side to the other. You can see I was able to get even these little narrow strips pretty straight by using that method where I sewed one edge down and then trimmed it instead of cutting it before I started. I really liked how that purple looked though. If I were going to go ahead and make an entire quilt out of this, and I had more of the purple, I would definitely experiment with making one have a wide purple border on the outside. It would be fun to have maybe one with just one narrow strip and then one wide one for the whole rest of the block. It's just fun to mix them up. But one reason that we chose this for the very first August block is one thing that I hear a big problem that often happens with block of the month is the person who wins the blocks gets them home and measures them, and oh dear, they're not all 10 inches. One might be 9 1/2, one might be 10 1/2. They're not all exactly the same. So with this particular block, if you happen to be the lucky person who wins them all, what you can decide to do is maybe you want to go ahead and move them on up to 12 inches. Then you'll be able to add a round or two to everybody's blocks. You can choose a fabric that will pull them all together and make them blend nicely that way, and then you'll be able to make them whatever finish size you decide. So I thought that would be a good choice for our very first block of the month. There it is.